Thank you very much to Mike Grundy. Now, we do have some time for some questions. So if anybody would like to raise an issue that has maybe caught their attention over the course of the last few speakers, we've got a couple of microphones in the middle of the aisles, and I think there's some up the back as well. If you're up the back, give me a big wave so I definitely know you're there. But while a few people want to make their way to ask some of those questions, maybe I'll get things started with one for you, Mike. The title of your talk, I suppose, hinted at something a bit gloomy, but your conclusion, I suppose, was a bit more optimistic. Where do you see the balance between optimism and pessimism of the challenges? You should just be able to use the microphone there. Yeah, they should work, I think.
This one.
Maybe? Give it a go? No? All right, try this one.
Yeah. Yes. Oh.
There we go. That one definitely works.
Yeah, well, look, apart from a general tendency to be optimistic about things, we are living in extraordinary challenging times, there's no doubt about that, but I can't think of a time when the ability of an individual farmer in particular to be able to understand just what is causing the risk associated with his enterprise and understanding that risk and what to do about it. We've never had anything quite like this in the past if we take advantage of it. I don't think yet we've taken advantage of it, but there's every good the reason to be optimistic is we actually have to survive these challenging times, and I think we probably have some of the tools to do it with.
Mm. And what puts the power in individuals' hands more than in previous times?
It's about the specificity that these technologies give us. So in the past we had varieties that were available for large areas of the country. You didn't get a variety for your place, for your local region. That now becomes possible. Or get something that's relevant to the needs that you have there. That wasn't available to us before. But in particular, this capacity to know what your machine is doing, what it's actually measuring and feeding that immediately back to you, how much you have in your shed, the extent to which your system is actually moving, the extent to which your system is actually performing and what you might do about it. We've never been able to do that before. And then the ability to turn this into something that's simple. And that's the sort of app revolution. To put something in the hands of people which actually answer the specific question they're asking, not confuse them with more detail than is needed.
Thank you. Okay, any questions from the audience? Somebody has to come and help me stand up and ask a question. Do I see? No, that's someone just covering their face up there. Hiding in a desperate attempt. Oh, there we go. Somebody's waving. Thank you very much, sir. I'll just get you to say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, my name is David Campbell, agribusiness freelance these days. I wanted to pick up on Mike's presentation. Having worked in the commercial sector over the last 40 years with many of the innovations that you referred to, and in companies that brought these technologies and innovations into Australia, and looking at where we're at, and we have this data revolution sort of now in front of us. One of the issues that comes up regularly with farmers, either at the individual level or farmer groups, and came up at the Evoke AgTech conference in Melbourne last week, was around trust. So, like you, Mike, I'm a soil scientist originally, and I still get happy about good soils maps, but what are we going to do about the trust issue? It's pervading everything in business these days and in society. It's a major issue. If you talk to companies, they want to own the data, they want to own the customer, they want to control the supply chain for all sorts of reasons, some of which Francis referred to. What are we going to do about this? How do we harness the technology but also maintain the trust and the collaboration that's needed to meet some of the challenges the Minister posed to us earlier this morning?
Well, there is no simple answer to the question, of course, which is why you asked it. We see around us a number of developments that are spurred by the opportunities. Now, and some of that is farmers themselves organising into communities who become data co-ops or owners of data. We see an explosion of small companies that are working in local regional areas. What I think is likely to emerge is that the advantages here are so local and so specific that there are such a wide range of business opportunities that the big owners of data, the big controllers of data, don't then provide something that is of value. So more industries are likely to spring up, I suppose. Recently, we had a day which we called our Greenhouse Day, where we pulled together a number of small companies that are playing into this area. And the energy of these small companies and the way in which they work with a clearly defined market segment, I think gives hope that there's a real market, much more real market with real equal power that will operate around the country. Now that's a hope. Let's observe whether it happens. But that for me is the best way of getting around the trust issue.
Thank you. We have another question.
Thought I'd better help out the MC.
Thank you.
Probably more to Mike than Steve, but Mike, having introduced GPS technology into the farming sector way back in the actual late 80s, early 90s, I very much understand the opportunities that technology is providing, and your link between technology and genomics is a key factor and a key partnership in certainly taking productivity potentially to another level. You mentioned natural capital, but very briefly, I think, in the overall gambit and looking at the the real possibilities for the future. And I should have said Gary Nann, I'm the chairman of the Mulloon Institute. So my more recent involvement over the last 10 years, I've really seen the incredible value in getting the actual landscape working properly first before you start applying the technology and the other smart science in genomics, and putting that great technology on top of a properly functioning landscape is certainly taking the sustainability and productivity to a greater level. And I asked, there should be, I think, more a comment, but you can respond to, and I think Steve's presentation probably glossed a bit in this area as well, that the massive opportunity, as we see it, and the work that we're doing is around getting those landscapes functioning correctly in the first place to provide increasing the pie that we have in water, for instance. Instead of we've got this amount of water, how much do go to the irrigators, how much goes to the environment? Let's have an argument about that. How about having an argument or a debate around growing that pie? And that's what comes from landscape repair, rehydration, and proper functioning landscapes.
I'll start, and Steve can correct me. In an ideal world, we'd stop for a while and we'd fix up all the problems we've got and then move on. That takes extraordinarily patient money, and it's very rarely the case that that's available to us. So the alternative is that you incorporate, and using the same sorts of approaches what I'm talking about there, you incorporate an observation of where your natural capital is currently at, where your opportunities, where you need to intervene in the short term, where you can let that carry on for a while, where you can make money in other parts of the world, so other parts of the farm. So I think in the real world, it's possible that this can be done in parallel. It's possible that it can be done in a way in which you can fund it, or we would hope that that were possible. There is no doubt, we have seen examples around this country where if the money is patient enough, then long-term sustainability and resilience is rewarded if you can get over those things that are hampering your production system. But many don't have that opportunity, and I think there are other ways of doing it as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks, Mike, for your response. I think Mike's sort of vision of a knowledge system for a farm where you actually know what's going on at the resolution per square metre helps to address sort of misconceptions and mismanagement of the past, which is based on best knowledge at the time. But thinking back to Mike's chart, which had this steep downward trajectory at the beginning from nutrient exhaustion, if you're tracking nutrients in and volumes out in your combine harvester, then you're alive to that much earlier. So I think there is real potential there. There's sort of the economic incentives are there already. So most of the productivity growth in cropping, most of the value growth, most of the profit growth is by better control of inputs. So we're making more money off less grain or off constant volumes of grain because we're spending our money more wisely on inputs. And I think that takes you pretty naturally into the notion that farmers are good stewards of the land when they have the right information at their fingertips. And that information is getting easier and easier to access and, in fact, harder and harder to ignore.
Thank you. We have a question from a gentleman in the middle here.
Keith Goppler from the Hancock National Resource Group. My question's probably mostly for Mr. Steve Dodds. You stated in your presentation that 20% largest farms account for 60% of production, and large farms are 25% more productive on average than the smallest farms. As we see, continued consolidation, and smaller farms becoming larger, I was wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the factors you see behind this consolidation, especially going forward, and then perhaps whether or not this could help reach that $100 billion challenge to see these, the value and the size of farms increase over time.
Yes, thanks, Keith, for the question. No doubt in my mind that continued consolidation of the sector will be a crucial part of realising the full potential of the sector. Big farms are more productive because more productive farms are able to sort of save up and buy the farm next door or down the paddock. There are economies of scale and there are economies of scope, so you see shifts in how farmers manage their portfolio of land. So it used to be that you'd run across the map, east-west, so you could have your machines ready to go at the one time. And now risk management suggests it's better to have them run north-south so you can manage volatility better. You can't manage that volatility as well if you're on one smaller patch. So those economies of scale and scope are important. And there are some things you can do to close the performance gap between large farms and medium farms. So work by ABARES, for example, demonstrates pretty conclusively that access to leasing rather than having to purchase the latest gear is really helpful for farms that aren't quite big enough to get that scale. But I'm pretty relaxed about the prospect of further consolidation because we know different farmers are in the game for different reasons. There are quite a few, in fact there's lots, there's more of them than others, there are quite a few small farmers who are there not just to make money. They're there because they like being on a farm. It's their money, it's their farm, it's their business, so I've got no problems with that. I don't think that's ever going to stop. But you might see more small farms with farm stay and B&Bs and leasing out some of the land for adjustment to somebody else who's a different manager. So all those things will be in play, and all those things are important. And I don't think we should be too concerned about them.
Thank you. Question from...
Rick Sinclair from Forest and Wood Products Australia. Whenever I attend these sessions, there seems to be always an elephant in the room that we never want to talk about, which is global insecurity and the potential of conflict. I just want a question for Frances, and I won't ask her that specifically, but something talked about the digital trading platforms. The threat of cybersecurity is growing and growing, and even when we talk at precision farming, we have farmers whose assets can be held hostage. We can have trading platforms that can be held hostage. What are we doing as a country to make sure that we can defend ourselves and our assets adequately in this very insecure world?
Rick, thanks very much for your question. I mean, the broader one, of course, is one that we're not unconcerned about either, although I do think, I'm an optimist too, like others on the panel, and there's a lot of diplomacy at play and a whole range of other things to try and keep, peace and security underpinning growth, particularly in our region and globally, of course. On the specific cyber question, I rather wish I could summon up Alistair McKibben, who heads up the Australian Cyber Security Centre. He would be very pleased to have heard your question, because one of the things he worries about is that there is insufficient awareness, if you like, across the board, globally, but let's just say in Australia, and across the business community about the nature of the risks. Now, it's not to say that government is doing everything that we absolutely could or need to do. We certainly need to be doing more, but we're working through, most departments have worked through the Essential 8 and the various steps that need to be taken. But it's also quite clear, if you read into cyber, if you follow it, even if you just read what's available publicly, that whether they are state actors or non-state actors, the threat of cyber intrusion, the pervasiveness of it, the damage that can be caused. I mentioned intellectual property in my speech as well too. But actually the Australian Cyber Security Centre really are the go-to people on this. They know they need to work across the board to improve Australia's cyber resilience. But they put out 18 months ago, 2 years ago, there was a big thing around managed service providers and significant breaches around those. And there was very little, I think it was KPMG did a significant report. There was very little response across the business community. And, it's surprising, but perhaps not, the number of people who've got very basic logins. Their passwords are, barely more sophisticated than ABCD at 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that. There is a significant investment that we need to be making. And the cyber world out there is pretty threatening. So that's the best answer that I can give. It's not necessarily a completely satisfactory example, but you will see the government investing more and more into this area. Across government, Australians rightly expect their personal details to be absolutely safeguarded. But then there are whole, questions around the examples you gave and a much wider range of intellectual property. And of course, it's not just about Australia. We're working with partners in the region. We've got a cyber ambassador for cyber affairs, for example. One of the things that he's working on is trying, through multilateral diplomacy, and this might sound a long way from where we are internally, but to try to create norms, rules, better capability across the place. There's a big debate at the moment, including in the United Nations, about the application of international law in cyberspace. So the government's doing a lot across the board, including through the cyber security strategy that Malcolm Turnbull published in 2016. I think the Foreign Minister's going to speak next week on an update on our international cyber engagement strategy. So there's a lot happening, but as a nation, we're going to have to lift our game, as will everyone else who wants to protect their data.
Thank you. And to this gentleman over here.
Great. Well, I really appreciated the three presentations this morning, as well as the Q&A. I'm Rob Johansson from USDA. Question, I guess, for Steve and Frances. Mike raised a lot of potential for science to answer some of the challenges moving forward. And that's something I often talk about as well. But what I've been asked about, and I'm just looking for a little assistance with your answers here, is how do you factor in changing consumer preferences that sometimes run at a bit of a tension to some of those opportunities presented to evolving technologies. So both from an economic standpoint in terms of the retail sector here in Australia, but also in terms of negotiating free trade agreements. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so excellent question. Welcome, Rob. I'm looking forward to hearing from you later on. So consumers are tough, you know, even tougher than teenagers as a parent. Consumer expectations are real and measurable and expressed in a variety of ways, including how they spend their money. But just like, you know, farming, a variable and complicated land, consumer expectations aren't simplistic or easy. So, for example, we carry around in our head a sort of, or typically, if you're like me, maybe you're smarter, a stereotypical view of a high-income consumer which is very strongly influenced by European sentimentality. Okay, so nature is good. So the Black Plague was, you know, a natural thing, but we don't worry about that. We just think nature is good. There's enormous volumes of research to back this up. So if you're dealing with recycled water, in the euphemism, you put that water into a creek for a little while, then you pull it out, you know, nature has blessed it and it's better to drink. We don't think about that in lots of things. You know, I had an eye trauma about a couple of years ago. I was really pleased at those gizmos and lasers and all the rest of it, and natural treatments wouldn't have done the job. So technology has enormous things to offer, but there's this sentiment issue. The reason why I sort of meander down this path is that it's an open question what the high wealth or middle income Asian consumer will look like. Okay, if you travel in China, everything is about, you know, modern this and modern that. Okay, the modern environmental economy. So it's perfectly open that a high income Asian consumer might be, you know, strongly in favour of GMO. You know, they appreciate that GMO can use less pesticide and less water, and nature is frequently sort of more tied up in it's okay to look at it, but you wouldn't want to eat it. So last time I was in China, I went to what I can only describe as a chicken factory. It had 3 million birds. People didn't see the birds very often. They used machines to check whether the chickens were sick by checking their temperature. They had more than 3,000 people a year through their factory to show it off because it was so impressive and it was so modern. Okay, so we've got. You have to dig deeper into what these consumer expectations are. I think Australia is a sort of country that can help shape those expectations as they evolve over time. But boy, we really need to take them seriously, because at the end of the day, you know, the consumer will win. Australia is competing for a very specific part of the market. We want to serve fussy consumers who are willing to pay, and we can only do that if we engage, in a sense, on their terms. We can meet them halfway and have a dialogue, but we can't just blame them because they don't think the way our grandfather used to think. Okay.
Now we're rapidly running out of time. Did you want to add any comments?
Look, I was just going to say, on the aspect, Rob, that relates to free trade agreements, of course, we've got to be very mindful of all of this. And I too would say, more probably with my China experience in mind, of course the consumer's always right, but China's changing consumer preferences have had a huge and broadly positive impact on Australia, whether you're a wine producer, whether you're about to plough your orange trees into the ground in the Riverland, and all of a sudden there's this massive demand for oranges from China or cherries around the time of Chinese New Year. But it's not just what we might always have supplied and the way we might always have thought of or packaged it. We've got to go and understand, and certainly when I was in China, there was a very regular flow of Australian visitors, including farmers, including, you know, winemakers and others, to actually really understand what the customer wants. So I see a whole lot of that as being about opportunity, but also delivery. I mean, you know, drones delivering things, Taobao, JD.com in China. I mean, the Australia Post connection on all of that. But we've got to have digital commerce rules that underpin it. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned in my speech that we need to be updating FTA rules. I mean, the gold standard at the moment is really the TPP 11. It's one of the reasons we're reviewing all of the older agreements, some of them more than a decade old, to update them to ensure that consumer-producer nexus is that we're able to support it through the trade agreements.
We'll just take one more question from this gentleman in the middle.
Adrian Trains from Fox Dairies. I just would like a thought from Francis. We're talking a lot about free trade agreements, but as far as I'm concerned, if we take them literally, they're not free trade agreements, they're just preferential trade agreements. So it's not, do you think they do give us ease of access, but they don't really allow us to free export our goods and services?
Sure. Well, look, thanks for the question. I mean, ongoing debate, obviously, how free is free. If Australian trade negotiators had our way all the time, they'd be completely free. We'd have 100% coverage in a way that not many countries will give us, to be honest. But, you know, there's free or there's no free trade agreement. And if you've got no agreement, you often will not have the sort of access at the reduced tariff levels, declining to zero, as I talked about before, that really do open markets. Of course, there are then issues about non-trade barriers, and I would never say to you, FTAs can do everything. They can create the opportunities, but we've got to be there, which is why government gave us a bit of money in the last budget to actually work with Austrade and work with, and across the board, business actually, as a focus on agriculture, but on the non-tariff barriers. So the two have to go in combination, and that was one of the reasons I said before, we need your feedback. But I think, I mean, you can look at literally billions of dollars of opportunity created for Australian producers through free trade agreements. So they might not be perfect, but in our world, you know, we'll get there. And as I said, the TPP 11 is the gold standard. If we can bring everything else up to that standard, we'll be doing pretty well. So, look, I'm a fan. They don't fix everything necessarily, but they make the world a whole lot better for our exporters.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all of your questions. Please join me in thanking our speakers this morning, Steve Hadfield-Dodds, Francis Adamson and Mike Grundy.